Supreme Court chamber sat in silence, its marble walls echoing with the weight of history. Outside, the air trembled with chants, camera shutters, and a nation holding its breath. Protesters pressed against barricades, their voices a chorus of demand and defiance, while reporters shoved microphones forward, desperate for the words that would define the century. Inside, 9 black-robed justices leaned forward, their eyes fixed on a single sheet of paper that carried the verdict. And then it happened. The announcement thundered across the courtroom with devastating clarity. Donald J. Trump, permanently barred from the presidency. The room froze, time itself suspended, before a collective gasp rolled like a tidal wave through the gallery. Gasps turned to murmurs, murmurs to shouts, and in the chaos, one truth settled like fire in the hearts of millions watching around the world. An untouchable giant had fallen. The cameras outside flickered with urgency. News tickers screamed the headline. And within minutes, every corner of America lit up with disbelief and exhilaration. People wept openly on the courthouse steps, strangers embraced, and phones buzzed with messages that began the same way. Did you hear? It is over. But as the shock surged through the nation, another question burned hotter than the verdict itself. How did it come to this? How did a woman underestimated, mocked, and dismissed manage to deliver the strike that stripped the most powerful man in America of his crown? The answer was not in the verdict alone. It was in the storm that built before it. For weeks leading up to the verdict, America felt like a country teetering on the edge of a cliff. Every conversation, every headline, every late-night debate circled back to the same haunting question. Would Donald Trump reclaim the keys to the White House? Or would this courtroom battle decide once and for all that his time was finished? It was not just about one man. It was about the soul of democracy itself. To many, it felt like history had reached a breaking point, a crossroads where the ideals written in the Constitution would either be honored or betrayed. The protests outside the Supreme Court grew louder with each passing day. Immigrant families held signs declaring justice for all. Young activists draped themselves in the American flag, and older veterans, some leaning on canes, stood in defiant silence as if guarding the promise they had once fought for. Across the nation, homes buzzed with restless energy. Parents whispered at dinner tables about what kind of country their children would inherit, while college students flooded social media with urgent posts that ended with one refrain: "This moment will define us." Inside the court, the tension was not confined to the marble halls. Every lawmaker, every strategist, every news anchor knew the outcome would reverberate far beyond politics. A ruling in Trump's favor would embolden his movement, shaking faith in institutions already battered by division. A ruling against him, however, could slam the door shut on his ambitions, signaling that no man, no matter his wealth or influence, could stand above the law. And that is why the world was watching. From small towns in the Midwest to immigrant neighborhoods in New York, from crowded apartments in Los Angeles to faraway capitals abroad, eyes remained fixed on Washington. Because what unfolded inside the court that day was more than a legal judgment. It was the pulse of America itself, a decision that would ripple through every home, every family, and every heart. And the story of how it reached this point began not with the verdict, but with the man who believed himself untouchable. Donald Trump walked into the months before the Supreme Court trial with the same swagger that had carried him through years of controversy. To his followers, he was untouchable, a man who thrived on chaos and reveled in the belief that the rules applied to everyone but him. He spoke with the certainty of a king, waving off indictments, mocking critics, and treating the courtroom as just another stage for his endless performance. For Trump, the law was not a boundary. It was an obstacle to bulldoze, a game to outwit, a script in which he always cast himself as the victorious star. His arrogance was not new. From the gilded towers of Manhattan to the rally stages where he promised power to the disenchanted, Trump built his empire on contradiction. He claimed to be a champion of working Americans while cutting deals that left workers empty-handed. He shouted about law and order while brushing aside his own legal entanglements. He called himself a patriot while casting doubt on the very institutions that had safeguarded the republic for centuries. Again and again, he positioned himself above accountability, daring the nation to stop him. And yet, beneath the bluster, cracks had always shown. Investigations trailed him like shadows. Business deals crumbled under scrutiny. Allies once loyal turned away when the costs became too high. But Trump dismissed each warning, each sign of weakness, with a wave of his hand and another rallying cry. In his mind, he was invincible. He had survived scandals that would have ended any other politician. He had bent the Republican Party to his will. He had stared down impeachment trials and emerged stronger in the eyes of his base. Why should this be any different? The contradiction was clear. He preached strength, yet every move was driven by fear of irrelevance. He clung to the presidency as both shield and weapon, convinced that only from that office could he maintain the illusion of dominance. To Trump, the White House was not service. It was survival. Losing it meant facing the full weight of accountability, a reckoning he had spent his entire life outrunning. But history has a way of humbling those who rise too high on arrogance alone. The higher the throne, the harder the fall. And as Trump stepped into the Supreme Court battle, he believed it would be another stage where he could bend truth into triumph. What he did not see was that the ground beneath him had already begun to crack, and a challenger far more formidable than he ever imagined was preparing to strike. Long before her name echoed in the chambers of the Supreme Court, Jasmine Crockett walked a path defined by struggle, grit, and an unshakable sense of justice. She was not born into privilege or power. Her story began in the hum of small neighborhoods where opportunities were rare, where families stretched every dollar, and where the promise of America often felt reserved for someone else. She saw firsthand how laws could be used as barriers instead of bridges, how voices from marginalized communities were dismissed as background noise. For Jasmine, silence was never an option. Her journey to the courtroom was paved with sacrifice. While classmates drifted into careers of comfort, she chose the law not as a profession but as a mission. She worked long nights, juggling multiple jobs to pay tuition, often studying by the dim glow of a lamp when exhaustion threatened to steal her focus. She remembered the faces of immigrants fighting to stay with their families, of women ignored, in courtrooms of young men punished more for their skin than their sins. Every case she studied was more than a textbook example. It was a life, a struggle, a story waiting for someone to fight. Even in the early days of her career, Jasmine was underestimated. Colleagues scoffed at her determination, rivals dismissed her sharp tongue, and critics labeled her too loud or too bold. But with every dismissal, her resolve deepened. She walked into hearings with the fire of someone who knew she was carrying more than her own ambition. She was carrying the weight of those who had been silenced for generations. Her courtroom style became legendary, not because she shouted the loudest, but because she cut through arrogance with precision. She had the rare ability to turn raw pain into undeniable truth. Her rise was not without cost. She endured threats, endured insults meant to break her spirit, endured the loneliness of a life lived in constant battle with systems that preferred quiet compliance. Yet, instead of breaking her, it sharpened her into a warrior who understood that justice was never freely given. It was demanded, seized, fought for with every ounce of courage one could summon. By the time her name reached the Supreme Court docket, she was no longer just an attorney. She was a symbol. To immigrant families, she was proof that the law could still be bent toward fairness. To young women of color, she was living evidence that fire could be strength, not weakness. To communities long ignored, she was their advocate, their fighter, their champion in a system that had rarely stood for them. And so, when she stepped into that towering courtroom, she carried not just a case, but the voice of millions. Each argument she prepared was sharpened by years of injustice endured, each line of evidence infused with the urgency of those who had waited too long to be heard. She knew she was facing a man who saw himself as untouchable, but she also knew she had been forged in places where survival demanded resilience. That contrast, his arrogance versus her endurance, would collide in a moment that could redefine America. And as she prepared to face him in the battle of her life, the tension in the air was more than legal. It was personal, it was historic, and it was about to explode into a confrontation unlike anything the nation had ever witnessed. The Supreme Court chamber became a battlefield of words. Each sentence weighted with history, each pause echoing with consequence. Trump's legal team entered the fray armed with bluster and technicalities, hoping to overwhelm the court with noise rather than substance. They spoke of executive privilege, of loyalty from millions, of a supposed mandate that could not be denied. Their tone carried defiance, as though the very presence of Trump in the courtroom was meant to intimidate. Yet, for all their confidence, the cracks began to show. Their arguments circled in repetition, their evidence flimsy under scrutiny, their certainty trembling when met with the pointed questions of the justices. Jasmine Crockett, by contrast, stood unwavering. Her voice was measured but sharp, her words slicing through the fog of distortion like a blade. Every point she raised was anchored in truth, every line of reasoning fortified by precedent and principle. She did not speak as one woman against a machine. She spoke as though she carried the weight of the people behind her, each syllable reverberating with their demand for justice. Where Trump's lawyers raised their voices in desperation, Jasmine allowed silence to work in her favor. She let their stumbles hang in the air, then dismantled their claims with precision that left the chamber breathless. The tension was palpable. Trump himself shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening as the tide of the battle began to turn. He whispered furiously to his attorneys, his usual bravado faltering under the steady rhythm of Crockett's assault. The gallery leaned forward, sensing the imbalance. It was no longer two equal sides clashing. It was arrogance slowly unraveling in the face of truth. At one pivotal moment, Trump's team argued that barring him from office would silence the voice of millions. Jasmine countered without hesitation. "No," she said, her tone firm yet calm. "What silences America is when one man believes he is greater than the democracy that created him. What silences America is the idea that power is privilege, not responsibility." The word struck like thunder, filling the chamber with a weight that even the justices seemed to absorb. The escalation was no longer abstract. It was visceral, a duel between ego and endurance, between fear and conviction. Each exchange pulled the room tighter, raising the stakes with every passing minute. And as Trump's legal team stumbled deeper into defense, it became clear to all who listened that this battle was racing toward a moment of reckoning, one that would leave the chamber and the nation holding its breath for the strike that was still to come. The chamber, already thick with tension, seemed to collapse into silence as Jasmine Crockett rose for what everyone sensed would be her defining moment. She adjusted the papers before her, though she hardly needed them. Every fact, every precedent, every truth had been burned into her memory. Across the aisle, Trump's legal team shifted uneasily, their earlier bravado reduced to whispers and nervous glances. Trump himself leaned forward, hands clasped tight, eyes darting as though waiting for some miracle to save him. When Jasmine spoke, her voice was steady, but there was a current running beneath it, a quiet storm, gathering strength. She began, not with legal jargon, but with the people. "This case," she declared, "is not about one man. It is about every citizen who believes that the law should protect the powerless as fiercely as it restrains the powerful." The words rang out like a gavel strike. A ripple of energy coursed through the gallery, and even the justices leaned closer, as if compelled by the weight of her conviction. One by one, she dismantled Trump's defenses. When his lawyers argued executive privilege, she countered with precedent after precedent that showed privilege had never meant immunity. When they claimed disqualification was an insult to voters, she reminded the court that democracy was safeguarded not by personalities but by principles. "The Constitution," she said, her gaze unwavering, "was never written to protect the ambitions of one man. It was written to protect the future of the nation." Each line landed harder than the last, striking at the hollow core of Trump's arguments until nothing remained but the truth. The room grew hotter, heavier, as if her words themselves carried the weight of centuries of struggle. Trump, who had built his persona on dominance, sat in uncharacteristic silence, his lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes flashing with frustration. The cameras caught his discomfort, and for the first time, the image of invincibility that had shielded him began to crack. Then came the moment that would be replayed across America, the line that would echo far beyond the courtroom walls. She turned, not just to the justices, but to the nation watching through screens and live streams. Her voice, calm yet resolute, carried the force of history. If a man who has undermined our laws, who has mocked our institutions, and who has treated the presidency as his personal throne, is allowed to return to power, then we are not protecting democracy. We are burying it, and I will not stand by and watch my country laid to rest. The words dropped like thunder. For a heartbeat, the courtroom froze in stunned silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on every soul present. Then, slowly, the murmurs began. First a ripple, then a wave. Reporters scribbled furiously, observers exchanged glances heavy, with realization, and even the marble columns seemed to hold the resonance of her declaration. Jasmine paused, letting the silence carry her message further than any added word could. She looked directly at the bench of justices, her final words cutting through the noise of centuries of power and privilege. This is not about him. This is about us. The choice before you is simple. Either affirm that no man is above the law, or admit that the law itself no longer matters. The chamber seemed to exhale in unison. The spell had been cast, the final blow delivered. Trump's you. Team sat hollow, drained of their fire, their strategy in tatters. Trump himself slumped slightly, as though the air had been stolen from him, and yet, in that silence, everyone knew the battle was not over. The arguments had been made, the lines drawn, but the decision, the verdict that would alter the course of American history, still hung in the balance. And as the justices withdrew to deliberate, the nation outside held its breath, waiting for the thunderclap of judgment that was about to shake the world. The verdict had not yet been read when the tremors began. Outside the Supreme Court, the crowd swelled to breaking point, phones lifted high, eyes glued to screens that carried Jasmine Crockett's words across the nation. Within minutes, hashtags ignited like wildfire. Justice prevails. Trump banned. Branches Crockett crushes. Twitter feeds erupted, Instagram filled with fiery graphics, and TikTok clips of her mic drop line racked up millions of views before the justices had even left the bench. News anchors, some visibly stunned, abandoned their scripts to capture the raw electricity of the moment. "This is history," one whispered over live coverage, while another declared, "We are witnessing the day America chose principle over personality." Networks replayed her final words on loop, framing them as the speech that shattered the illusion of invincibility. Across cable channels, panels lit up with fiery debates, each side scrambling to interpret what had just unfolded. But even skeptics could not ignore the shift in the air. In cities across America, spontaneous rallies broke out. In New York, young immigrants danced in the streets, waving flags and holding signs that read, "Our voice won." In Chicago, church bells rang as crowds gathered on courthouse steps to sing hymns of victory. In Los Angeles, a mural began to take shape overnight. Jasmine Crockett, hand raised, standing over the cracked silhouette of a crown. Even in the smallest towns, neighbors who rarely spoke about politics nodded to each other with a sense that something larger than themselves had just taken place. But the reaction was not limited to celebration. Trump loyalists raged online, warning of betrayal, threatening unrest, clinging desperately to a man whose grip on power had just slipped. Their fury, however, was drowned by the tidal wave of voices cheering the decision. For once, the outrage of the few could not smother the hope of the many. Celebrities, athletes, and world leaders chimed in. A pop star tweeted, "This is the America I believe in." A Nobel laureate called it a turning point in the global fight for democracy. Across oceans, allies applauded, while autocrats scowled at the sight of accountability in action. Yet beneath the euphoria, a deeper question lingered. If this was the moment America chose to rise above arrogance, what came next? How would the nation carry forward the lesson carved in that chamber, the truth that no man, no matter how powerful, could outlive justice? That answer would come not in the hashtags or the headlines, but in the moral clarity Jasmine herself delivered when the dust began to settle. When Jasmine Crockett finally stepped outside the Supreme Court, the roar of the crowd washed over her like a wave. Cameras flashed, chants echoed, and tears streamed down faces that had waited a lifetime to feel this kind of vindication. Yet Jasmine did not bask in triumph. She lifted her hand for silence, and when the noise dimmed, her words rose with a clarity that pierced through the chaos. "This is not about me," she said, her voice steady, carried by conviction rather than volume. "This is about us, about the people who built this country, about those who came here seeking freedom, about every citizen who has ever felt unseen or unheard." Today the court affirmed that democracy is not the property of one man. It belongs to all of us. The crowd erupted, but Jasmine pressed on, her eyes scanning the sea of faces. She spoke of dignity, of sacrifice, of the countless Americans who had carried the dream of equality even when the system bent against them. She reminded them that justice was not permanent. It required vigilance, courage, and the willingness to stand up when standing felt impossible. Her words struck deeper than celebration. They became a mirror in which people saw their own struggles, their own resilience, reflected back at them. The victory was not framed as the end of a battle, but the continuation of a responsibility. She closed with a line that would echo for generations. "Let this moment remind us all. Power is fleeting, but principle endures. Arrogance fades, but dignity never dies." In that instant, the triumph transformed into something greater than a verdict. It became a lesson, a legacy, a call for America to rise above fear and division, to claim the values that had always been promised but not always delivered. And as the cheers swelled once more, the stage was set for her words to ripple far beyond that courthouse, into the conscience of a nation still deciding who it wanted to be. History is not written in silence. It is carved by those who dare to speak when silence would be easier, by those who refuse to bow when power demands submission. Jasmine Crockett did not just win a case, she exposed a truth, that justice only breathes when people stand guard over it. The gavel has fallen, the verdict is sealed, and the chapter of one man's dominance is closed. But the story does not end here. The true question is what each of us will do with this moment. Will we treat it as spectacle, a headline to be consumed and forgotten? Or will we take it as a charge, a reminder that democracy is not self-sustaining? It survives on our courage, our vigilance, our willingness to fight for each other. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power of principle over arrogance, do not let it fade. Share it. Talk about it. Carry it forward. Because when one voice speaks for justice, it can echo. But when millions answer back, it can never be silenced. The choice is ours. The time is now, and history is waiting.